Hey, welcome to our special here on the First TV, a special on the worst presidents in history. Got to learn from our mistakes, right? Got to learn from these lessons because history can repeat itself. Now, from time to time, you'll see a ranking of the best and worst presidents. There's like 4 different organizations that do this every single year. If they put Donald Trump at the bottom of the list or very near the bottom, then you can dismiss that list. That is ridiculous. If you put Trump as the worst president ever, you're a partisan hack. In the most recent surveys, U.S. News and Siena College, their presidential experts poll, put Trump as 3rd worst. Their C-SPAN presidential historians poll has him as 4th worst. And the Presidential Greatness Survey has him as the absolute worst president of all time. These people are total hacks. And you know, because these surveys also put FDR as the best president. You're putting FDR as the best president. You're putting him above Lincoln and George Washington. That's insane. Which is crazier? Which is more insane? Not putting Lincoln or Washington as the best or putting Trump last? Equally so. So these people obviously are not to be trusted. And it's not just me. I mean, they're biased, right? This is a survey done in 2017. I'm sure it's worse today. Among history professors, all right? These are the people who do these surveys, right? For every one Republican who's a history professor, for every one Republican history professor, there's 33 Democrats. And I bet it's even worse than that because this survey probably didn't even include Marxists and communists who may not even consider themselves Democrats, but they're certainly not conservatives. Historians and the history departments are the most biased political departments in all the university system. Right? Of the universities who are surveyed in this one survey, 60% of history departments have 0 conservatives. None. Not a single guy who's even like the token conservative. There's none, not any. 60% of none. We're only tied with journalists. Journalism professors are just as bad as history professors. And then we wonder why, these are the 2 super messed up things in our country. Why the media and why our history knowledge are so screwed up. Right? There's one of your answers right there. I can't wait for Trump to just take a blowtorch to all of this. All right, anyway, so that's the background. That's why the other lists are junk. I'm going to present today who we believe are actually some of the worst presidents. One of our guests is going to make the case that Obama was the worst. Another guest will make the case that FDR was the worst. Also LBJ and Woodrow Wilson. Now we're not going to nitpick over who's the absolute worst, but these are people who deserve to be in the running for the worst president in our history. I'll give you 2. I'll lay out 2 here before we get to our guests here. These presidential surveys who said that Trump was almost the worst, they went with James Buchanan as the actual worst. Bill O'Reilly has a new book out about all the different presidents, and he agrees with this. He's like, Bill O'Reilly's like hardcore, no doubt, James Buchanan is the worst president ever. His goal, the reason he was elected, was to prevent the country from finally tipping into an all-out civil war. Didn't work. He failed at that. Now, at first glance with James Buchanan, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt, right? Because how much influence could one man have in stopping a runaway train towards civil war? I'm a nice guy. I want to give Buchanan a little bit of, what's he going to do? But the more you study James Buchanan, the more you realize this guy really blew it. He thought that the slavery issue between the North and the South would disappear if he could just keep everyone happy enough. So he would appoint some people from the North and some people from the South to be in his cabinet and to be in different positions, try to keep everyone happy and everyone from getting, shooting at each other. And he would present slavery like it's not that even big of an issue, right? And he said that new states that are coming into the Union should decide on their own whether they want to be slave or free, okay? But the question was, well, when should that state decide if they're slave or free? Well, in his inaugural address, he said this. He said, "This question is happily a matter of but little practical importance. Besides, it's a judicial question, which legitimately belongs to the Supreme Court of the United States, before whom it is now pending, and will, it is understood, be speedily and finally settled." So he's like, I'm just going to do whatever the Supreme Court says on this issue, and it's no big deal. 2 days later, the Supreme Court made their decision on Dred Scott. And they ruled that slaves cannot be citizens, and therefore Dred Scott can't sue. Now, again, well, how much does Buchanan have to do with this? Buchanan, it turns out, did everything he could to tip the court the way he wanted it to go. And that was to make a broad decision. The court could have made a narrow ruling on just Dred Scott, but Buchanan wanted the court to make a broad ruling that applied to all free blacks and slaves, North and South. And he thought that that is what would lead to national harmony that we all needed. Not at all. The decision also said that slaves are property and no one can deprive a slave owner of his own property. It is the worst Supreme Court decision ever. And he played a role in that. He tipped the scales on that. And for that, he deserves our scorn. He also said that the southern states are not allowed to secede from the Union. But then he said that the federal government can't prevent them from leaving. Like, well, thank God for Abraham Lincoln, who felt differently on that point. So Buchanan just missed the mark big time when history needed him to do better. So that's, almost everyone says he's the worst president of all time. And I can go along with that. Can I add a controversial addition as my second submission? I'm not saying he's the worst, but I think when we talk about maybe the worst 10 or so, I think he should be someone that we add to the list. Now don't get mad at me. Let me make my argument. I think someone that we should consider is George W. Bush. Now, we were all alive during George W. Bush, so this can be very personal. Like if I make fun of James Buchanan, you have no personal play in that. So you're like, whatever, James Buchanan, you can make fun of him all you want. But you're like, hold on, I liked George W. Bush. All right, so what's going on here? You're insulting me, Slater. No, I liked George W. Bush too. But let me make my argument. I liked him as like a nice guy. And I liked him when he was president. If we are going to be critical of the botched Afghanistan withdrawal under Joe Biden, and we are critical of that. We should be. Doesn't some blame also have to go to the wisdom of the Afghanistan entrance? You're like, no, that's different. That was 9/11. Okay, all right. Maybe we had to go in after 9/11. Fine. But I'm not sure why he gets a pass from conservatives on Iraq. What are we still doing that? We're still weapons of mass destruction? There's a hesitancy to talk negatively about W because maybe it still sounds like we're criticizing or belittling the service and sacrifice of the Iraq War veterans. But that's not it. Those are totally, completely different things. Totally different. And we're smart enough to know that difference. George W. Bush's push for home ownership, right? This following in line with the Clintons before him. But that directly led to the housing crash of 2008. Hurt a lot of people. Now, I know it was a different era of conservatism back then versus right now, so I'm not going to hold Bush accountable, right? It's sort of like what the left does when they hold people from 200 years ago based off the morals and standards of today. I'm not going to do that even with Bush back in 2000. I'm not going to hold him super accountable for not taking a chainsaw to the bureaucracy like Trump is going to do. But like we were still supposed to be the party of limited government, even way back in 2000. He didn't do anything about that. He didn't shrink government. I still have to take my shoes off at the airport because of the Department of Homeland Security. We still have to deal with the Patriot Act. So I get it. I mean, listen, after 9/11, the picture of him standing on the rubble with the bullhorn, that was great, that moment. Throwing out the first pitch at the World Series, that was awesome. Definitely the best first pitch of all time. But all that post 9/11 stuff led to the Patriot Act and led to the Iraq War and Afghanistan. So, I don't know. Is that good leadership? Like someone like, he's a great leader after 9/11. I don't know, was he? Remember when he nominated Harriet Miers to be his Supreme Court pick? And then he withdrew her in shame. Just mocked mercilessly. You did what? You're going to nominate who? And then he nominated Sam Alito. So I got that one right. But geez, man, what are you doing? And George W. Bush's first presidential effort was to reform Social Security, and it failed. And that was it. That was it. That was all of his political capital. And then it was 9/11. But there was nothing after that. That was all. It's like, oh, well, I guess I'm a lame duck now. And then if you look at his biggest accomplishments, like the top answer people will give is, well, he gave a lot of money to Africa to combat AIDS. I'm like, all right, I guess. $15 billion over 5 years. Do we care if it like helped anyone or like worked at all? Nah, just money had a problem. That's all. Good enough for B. So I guess Bush was a nice enough guy. He had a nice moment again at 9/11 or whatever, but I don't know. That's not enough for me. I'm not saying he's the worst, but I think a case can be made for that, for him being near the top. And I think conservatives shouldn't be afraid to think about that. I'll add Biden to another contender in that top 10 worst or lowest 10. And I'll make the case for that at the end of the show. I'm not saying he's the worst, but certainly should be in the running. Let's take a break. We'll come back. We'll talk about FDR, Woodrow Wilson, LBJ, and Barack Obama. Worst presidents in American history, right here on the First TV. Hey, welcome back to our special here on the First TV, the worst presidents in American history. I want to go to Dr. Paul Moreno. He's a professor of history at the wonderful Hillsdale College. Dr. Moreno, how are you, sir?
Well, very, very good. Thanks. Great to be here.
I'm grateful you're here. So my understanding is we have 3 additions to this list. Let's go in chronological order. What do you think about Woodrow Wilson?
He's, in many ways, perhaps the worst president in all of American history because he was the first one to fundamentally undermine the constitutional nature of the American presidency and to change it. Going back to the 1870s, Wilson was an academic for decades before he went into politics. And he wrote some of the most important and fundamental works criticizing the American Constitution.
Can you give me an example of what did he not like about the Constitution?
Oh, well, he wrote one of the first essays about the administrative state. It was called The Study of Administration in the first or second volume of the American Political Science Review. And basically he said that the United States doesn't have a European-style centralized bureaucratic state, and we need one. So right there, he sort of laid the groundwork for the whole 20th century administrative state, the swamp, the very thing that President-elect Trump is dedicated to doing something about. So he's really taking on something that began to be built by Woodrow Wilson, in the middle of the 19th century.
What was Wilson's worldview that had him think we should take on more the European style and have this animosity towards the Constitution as it was and had been?
It was very common among the group of people who would come to be called progressives that the United States had entered a new era, that the Industrial Revolution, the Urban Revolution, the modern world meant that the old Constitution that the framers gave us was out of date and obsolete. And that's another one of Wilson's fundamental contributions was the idea of the living Constitution, the idea that the founders' principles we've outgrown them, that the Constitution was fine for the 18th century when we were a country of 4 million people, mostly farmers, but the world has changed and the Constitution has to change with it. So Wilson's basically a historicist or a relativist who believes that there are no permanent, self-evident truths in politics or anything else for that matter, that our ideas and our institutions have to evolve along with changing social circumstances. So if you say something like all men are created equal, that might be, sometimes, but maybe not at other times. So Wilson really just undermined the entire intellectual world and assumptions, the sort of classical liberalism, the natural rights philosophy of the American founding. He was a very profound challenge to the founding.
How did he win? Did he make those arguments at the time?
That's where moving from political theory to political history is really interesting because Wilson, again, he had this long academic paper trail, but it really didn't come up in his political career. He went from being the president of Princeton University in 1910 to one term as governor of New Jersey, and then he went right into the national arena in 1912. And he won that election only because the Republican Party had split. Theodore Roosevelt and the incumbent, William Howard Taft, had a falling out. And so they divided the Republican vote, and Wilson was able to win with about 40% of the national popular vote. He didn't win a single state outside of the old Confederacy. So he really wasn't any stronger than any of the preceding Democratic presidents, some of whom Miles Smith talked about, like Grover Cleveland. But he was able to take advantage of this occasional fracturing of the Republican Party. And the one who really should have noted this was William Howard Taft, who was relatively conservative. Theodore Roosevelt was very progressive himself, and Wilson ends up doing a lot of what Theodore Roosevelt had called for in the election of 1912. But Taft, as a constitutionalist, should have noticed, but for various reasons, one of which was Taft thought that Roosevelt was more of a threat to the American Constitution than Wilson was. And based on Wilson's campaigning in 1912, there was reason to believe that. In some ways, Wilson presented himself as the most traditionalist or conservative of the three candidates. I think if I'd been voting in 1912, I might have voted for Wilson.
Interesting. The deceit. It goes back a ways too. I want to keep talking about it, but we should move on to the other two. If we were talking about these presidential lists that come out, they rank the best and worst presidents, like 4 of them that always come out. And all these lists put FDR as the best. They put him above Washington, above Lincoln. They put him as the best president. Why do you make the case that FDR was one of our worst?
Partly this is because I think the reason FDR gets the accolades that he does is mostly because of World War II, that he was the president who oversaw the war effort during what we still consider to be the good war. If it hadn't been for that, if FDR had ended his presidency after 2 terms, as was the tradition, he would have been considered a failed president. The Depression was still going on. The New Deal really didn't work economically, although it did put together a new coalition in the Democratic Party. But most of all, the reason I think he's a failure, a bad president, was because of his continuation of this progressive undermining of the constitutional assumptions of the United States. Because FDR went further than Wilson. If you look at what Wilson actually did, you got the Federal Reserve Act, you got the first income tax, you got the Federal Trade Commission, but really nothing that was sort of radically new compared to earlier reforms of the American political economy. With FDR, you get the beginning of the entitlement state, of the centralized bureaucratic state of the kind that we're dealing with today. Social Security is the mother of all the entitlement programs. I think the biggest one of all was the National Labor Relations Act, which made organized labor the most powerful interest group in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. And Roosevelt had more ambitious plans to centralize the bureaucratic state under the president's control. The wheels fell off of that, though, because he very foolishly took on the Supreme Court. The court was standing in the way of some of the New Deal programs. And after he won re-election in 1936, FDR very deviously launched this plan to allow Congress to let him add 6 justices to the court. And it was so shocking and so transparently political that Congress began to resist and push back. And that was pretty much the end of the New Deal.
Wow. What was his worldview? Why did he think that this was the way to go?
Yeah, FDR, if anything, is even more mysterious than Woodrow Wilson because he had no academic background. Most people regarded FDR as being just a lightweight. I think Oliver Wendell Holmes said he was a first-class temperament and a second-class intellect. That he had political instincts, but he really had no philosophy, no ideology. Now, some political theorists have challenged this, and they said that if you look at some of his speeches, especially the Commonwealth Club address that he gave in 1932, just before he won the election, he really did have this vision of what he called the era of enlightened administration. Again, continuing very much on Wilsonian lines, that the time had come to replace the old, essentially business elite of the sort of classical liberal period with the administrative state, with people who were, came out of the American universities. Roosevelt had the brain trust, people especially from Columbia University who were his advisors, and people who would staff these agencies, the experts, the scientists of their day. And so Roosevelt, I think, was continuing along Wilsonian lines in trying to create what today is referred to as the administrative state.
That's amazing that we're still fighting these battles today. But maybe this is the time to uproot all of this once and for all. We'll see how far Vivek and Elon can go. I'm sensing a theme here, perhaps, with our third suggestion as well. Where's LBJ fit in this list?
Yes, in fact, the political scientist Charles Kessler wrote a book called I Am the Change about Obama and the fourth wave of progressivism. And essentially the three that I picked were the first three waves: Wilson and the Progressives, FDR and the New Deal, and then Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. Johnson, very self-consciously, he just wanted to outdo FDR. He recognized that the New Deal had been stalled by, again, the collapse of Roosevelt's domestic policy and then by America's international commitments and Eisenhower, the hiatus in the 1950s. But when liberalism made a comeback with JFK's election, and especially Johnson's landslide victory in 1964, he wanted to complete the New Deal. And so things like Medicare and Medicaid especially, which were just extensions to Social Security, as Obamacare was an extension to Medicare and Medicaid. Of course, there's the civil rights legislation and the beginnings of affirmative action that you had in the Johnson administration, the beginning of a whole new area of policy that didn't concern so much economics and business. Most progressive regulation had been about regulating big business. But this was the beginnings of what we call today identity politics. The civil rights movement, feminist claims that begin to sort of piggyback onto civil rights, the homosexual rights movement by the end of the 1960s. These are all really offshoots of Great Society legislation that is trying to regulate in a new kind of way. Environmental regulation, doing things like workplace safety and the environment, which cover just every aspect of people's lives. The 1960s was the real beginning of a federal government that ordinary people would notice, affecting their everyday lives.
Wow. Okay. So what do you think these three men, and our next guest is going to talk about Obama, so you can include him here if you want, but what do you think these three men missed? Like, what were they missing about what you and I would value in this country or of our Constitution that led them to go a totally different way?
Yeah, in fact, this is probably true of just about every American president going into the 20th century. Maybe the last constitutional president was Calvin Coolidge, somebody who really understood and was dedicated to and could speak about and could articulate the principles of the American founding. This is partly a failure of the educational system in the United States. It's partly a result of the way that American politics had developed. Very gradually, you ended up replacing, again, Miles Smith talked about this, where the founders expected that Congress would be the most important part of the government because that was the part of the government that was closest to the people, and in a republic, the people are sovereign. The presidency began to eclipse the legislature in the 20th century, and these presidents were a product of that. They just sort of took for granted the principles of progressivism and New Deal liberalism, that the president is the center of the government. And a part of the reason why they all ran up against significant opposition was all the things that the federal government tries to do in the 20th century are just impossible for one person to manage. The tasks that the federal government were supposed to undertake under the Constitution were very limited. Most of them had to do with foreign policy and sort of genuinely interstate things. Domestic matters, or what were called in constitutional law, the police power, was supposed to be left to the states. And so the centralizing of the government in the federal government, removing the place that the states had in this, and then within the federal government, centralizing power in the office of the presidency just became an impossible task.
Amazing. We just talked recently with one of your colleagues at Hillsdale, who's an expert in the Gilded Age. So we spoke a bit about that era where the presidency was of less importance than the legislative branch. Maybe one day we can get back to that. I got about 60 seconds. Let's go back to maybe to Wilson, but all these guys, and today, who think that we have a living Constitution. What is your response to the people who believe that, or that the Constitution is no longer relevant because we're not a bunch of farmers anymore?
Well, certainly, I mean, the Constitution has a mechanism for adapting itself to change circumstances, the amendment process. And the progressives should have been very aware of this because there were, probably 4 amendments that bore the fingerprints of the progressive movement. The direct election of senators, the income tax, prohibition, and women's suffrage. And it's notable that, especially during the New Deal, you don't see any formal change in the Constitution. It was all done informally. Apart from the 22nd Amendment, which limits the president to 2 terms, which probably wasn't a good idea.
Dr. Paul Moreno, professor of history at the wonderful Hillsdale College. Dr. Moreno, great to talk to you, sir. Thanks for your insight.
Thanks again for having me.
Coming up next, we'll continue on with this trend and go to that 4th progressive, Barack Obama. Why was he our worst president ever? We'll talk with Lee Smith next, right here on The First TV.
The most important election in this country's history was 2008. And we have paid and will continue to pay the price for losing that election for years to come, because that is the election that brought us Barack Hussein Obama.
Jesse Kelly, right there. Want to go right to Lee Smith, author of the new book, Disappearing the President, Trump, Truth Social, and the Fight for the Republic. Lee, good to talk to you, brother. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It might pain some people out there that Jesse Kelly is 100% right. Certainly on that assessment about Barack Obama.
What is your case for how Barack Obama is one of our worst presidents ever? Where do you begin?
A lot of the things that we're seeing now, a lot of the things that we've seen over the last 8 years of what I do in Disappearing the President, I identify that this multi-pronged and ongoing campaign targeting Donald Trump, his aides and supporters, these all started with Barack Obama. We're talking about the censorship campaign. We're talking about surveillance. We're talking about election interference. And also we're talking about political violence, too. All of these things started with Barack Obama. But look, even before then, there's something that went unnoticed by most people unless they follow foreign policy closely, especially the Middle East. And as I do, I'm a Middle East analyst, and one of the most really just freakishly bizarre things was when Obama pushed the nuclear deal with Iran. And this was misrepresented at the time, not surprisingly, by the media. But this was never designed to stop Iran from getting a bomb. This was putting Iran's nuclear weapons program under the protection of an agreement with the United States of America. Right? What it did, it legalized the nuclear weapons program of a terrorist state that has been killing Americans since 1978. So once you stick with that, and people have been asking me for a long time, I don't get it. Why would he want to give Iran the bomb? Why would he do it? I think we have a much clearer answer now in 2024 when we see how he used the intelligence agencies against his political opponents, including Donald Trump, especially Donald Trump. I think we have a much better idea who Barack Obama is and what this administration was really about. There's nothing like it in American history. Certainly, we've had problems with domestic surveillance. We've had, presidents who were Richard Nixon, who abused different aspects of their executive authority. But Barack Obama is absolutely 100% outside of the American tradition. And this is one of the profound and destructive ironies of Barack Obama, the man who's one of whose catchphrases was, "That's not who we are as Americans." But remember, the purpose of that catchphrase was to distinguish people who followed Barack Obama from everyone else. Everyone else was not really truly American. Remember, this is what he did with Donald Trump, saying that Donald Trump had been compromised by Vladimir Putin. So, yeah, that's my case for why Obama is not just the worst American president, but certainly the most destructive and also the most un-American of American presidents.
All right, give me another example. Give me another specific example of how he weaponized the government against political enemies.
Well, it's very important to understand right after Russiagate started to break in 2017, one of the big revelations was that the Hillary Clinton campaign paid for this, this dubious dossier written by this FBI informant, Christopher Steele. But the really important thing to remember, the crucial thing to keep in mind is all of this was done not by the Clinton campaign. It was Obama's spy chiefs, right? James Comey and John Brennan especially. And we know that Obama was tipped off no later than August 2016 about what was going on here with these rumors about Trump and Russia. And Obama could have pulled this back at any time. He knew that the FBI was investigating Trump based on these garbage rumors, based on a smear campaign invented by Clinton World. He could have pulled it back and said, no, come on, guys, get serious. To investigate a presidential campaign, this is a scandal waiting to happen. And besides, no one believes this garbage about Trump and Russia. So that right there is pretty clear evidence that we're talking about an American far outside the American mold.
What is the Barack Obama worldview that led him down this path, you say?
The Barack Obama worldview is something that we see in faculty lounges across America, right? That that America is a bad place. America is fundamentally flawed, and America is fundamentally evil. And, we can spend a lot of time talking about the hypocrisy of that. Oh, but don't you understand? You have the freedom to criticize America from inside your faculty lounge here and make a good living here. It doesn't matter. This is the worldview. It's an anti-American worldview. It's the idea that America is poison at its very source, right? It's the 1619 worldview. So this is the worldview that we've seen becoming more and more powerful. And of course, this was the worldview dominating the Biden administration and virtually all of its moves, whether it's in foreign policy, whether it was going around and promoting the LGBT agenda, and throwing military personnel out of the Pentagon because they were accused of being white supremacist or Christian nationalist. So that's Obama's worldview. I know it's very strange for people that someone who believes what they believe in faculty lounges in Boston and Palo Alto, that's really what motivated him. But again, that's exactly what it is. One of them was elected president of the United States, and that was Barack Obama.
Yeah. Amazing. What's a policy you would point to in his 8 years that you thought was most destructive?
Well, again, I think that the Iran nuclear deal is absolutely insane, right? This was a way. Again, the idea. The United States the United States has always been against nuclear proliferation, even with our allies, right? When Taiwan wanted to develop a nuclear weapons program, we were dead set against it. This is the history of the United States with nuclear proliferation. We're always against it. We were against it when the Israelis did it, and the Israelis are very close to us now. We were against it when the Brits did it half a century ago. But all of a sudden, when a terror state wants to push forward on its nuclear weapons program, Barack Obama says, yeah, that's okay. You can't stop the knowledge. You can't bomb away the knowledge. So let's just legalize the program, put certain restrictions on now, and over time these restrictions will sunset. That's why they're called sunset clauses. And at the end of that period, the Iranians will have a fully legitimate industrial scale nuclear weapons program. So that, to me, again, as someone who looks closely at foreign policy as well as domestic policy, and how these two aspects of a White House's ethos reflect each other, that to me is the single most important policy to look at. Why would you jeopardize and risk American interests like that by making this deal with this clearly, patently anti-American regime? And again, I think that we have to see that partnership with an anti-American regime reflects the prerogatives and priorities of an anti-American president, just who Barack Obama was.
What aspect of Barack Obama do you think Trump was the greatest rebuke of, with either what Trump has done or said or what the American people voted Trump for?
Well, I mean, I think the idea of making America great again. Look, in a sense, that's a challenge to Obama's legacy. If Obama needs to be, if America needs to be made great again, who ran America into the ground? Well, that was Barack Obama. So I think that as a whole, Trump's presidency, his candidacy, represented a rebuke of Obama. I think something else that we need to look at, and again, talking about Obama outside the American grain, it's something I talk about in Disappearing the President, and something I try to remind people of as much as possible. The last president to stay in Washington, D.C. was Woodrow Wilson a century ago. Wilson couldn't leave the nation's capital because he had a debilitating stroke midway through his second term. He couldn't be moved. Barack Obama announced at the beginning of his second term that he was going to stay in Washington. Now, the reason that presidents leave Washington is because none of them have ever wanted to leave the impression that somehow they're interfering in the clear transfer of executive authority from one president to another. And nonetheless, Barack Obama has stayed in Washington, D.C. since 2016. Remember, after our election several weeks ago, Barack Obama released a statement about the election. Again, another first for Barack Obama. No president, no former president has ever released what was effectively a concession speech. Why did Barack Obama do it? Again, to let people know that he is still actively involved in shaping the destiny of the nation. This is
wow.
This is un-American.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. And I wonder what role he'll have. And maybe I'll end that. We got about 2 minutes, but where like George W. Bush doesn't have a place in this Republican Party anymore, right? For instance. Right. Do you think the Democrats will rebuke Obama and push him aside and move forward in a different direction? Or will he continue to have control over the party?
I think this will be an interesting struggle. Look, the loss is his, right? It was Kamala Harris is Barack Obama's candidate, has been since 2019. He wanted her for 2020, right? But the Democratic Party voters turned her down. I think one important thing we're going to see in this struggle, this is not like when Michael Dukakis lost in 1988 and the Democrats went back to the drawing board and that's when they came up with Bill Clinton. Wow, Democratic Leadership Council, we're going to move to the center and come up with ideas that Americans like. I think it's going to be very hard for them to do this because the radicalism is baked into the educational system, right? They are producing and reproducing those ideas not only now in colleges, but as we see with this insanely destructive and vicious trans agenda, they're trying to reproduce these ideas in high school as well. So it's going to be very hard for them to shake a lot of their, even a lot of their most insane ideas.
Yeah, well, we'll have to shake them ourselves and win. Lee Smith, the book is Disappearing the President, Trump, Truth Social, and the Fight for the Republic. Lee, thanks for leading that fight. Grateful for you.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on again.
Thank you. Come back and we'll make the case for talking about worst presidents in American history. Where does Joe Biden fit on this list? Do that next. Mike Slater, First TV. Spread the word. Welcome back to our special, The Worst Presidents in American History. And who have we talked about so far? We talked about James Buchanan. Got James Buchanan. I threw in there maybe a little wild card, maybe this is a little too spicy for now. I don't know. George W. Bush, maybe should be talked about in the running. We talked about Woodrow Wilson, FDR, LBJ, and Barack Obama. Those four right there, they're all the same. They just all jumped off the most previous president's progressivism. I want to make the case here, though, that we should talk about Joe Biden as one of the worst presidents of all time. Too soon to say for sure, right? Biden may get a bit of a bailout from Trump, right? All of the mistakes that Biden made and all the bad things he did for this country, all the people his policies hurt in this country, he may get a bailout for Trump. So history may not paint him as bad as maybe history should. So where Biden may let in 20 million illegal aliens and all these terrible things would continue to happen for that, but 20 million illegal aliens were deported under President Trump. So its full negative effect wasn't able to be fully implemented. Does it make sense? Because of Trump. So maybe Biden lucks out a little bit here. Or maybe Biden, makes our military so woke and unprepared to fight wars. But then Trump comes right in and brings our military back. So Biden's not going to be blamed for the problems that he caused as much as he maybe if he had another 4 years. So maybe the best for Biden, the best case scenario for Biden is he'll just be forgotten. We did a little bit with the presidential rankings earlier, the best and the worst presidents, and maybe he'll just be like somewhere in the middle. Maybe that's where Biden, he'll just be like forgotten, like a Martin Van Buren or a Millard Fillmore or a Chester Arthur and a Joe Biden. And I'll just be like, oh yeah, I kind of heard of him. That's the best Biden can hope for, right? It'll be like Trump, Biden, Trump. Like who is in between Grover Cleveland? I don't know. Who's going to be in between the Trump years? People even forget. Biden can only hope. All right, so let's keep in mind a couple of things. I got 5 reasons why I think Joe Biden should be in the running as one of our worst presidents ever. Foreign policy. And there's 3 big ones. Afghanistan withdrawal, totally botched it. Russia, Ukraine, and Hamas and Israel. Bad, all of them bad. This particular picture of the plane taking off in Afghanistan, that is one of the defining images of his presidency. And that all came from his weakness. I heard Trump the other day say, he just talked about how awful it was that he said there was like some battle in Ukraine where 10,000 people were killed. And no one even talks about it, no one cares. And here's Trump out here talking about how awful it is. And he cares because it was a loss of life. I've never seen a president be so anti-war to his core as President Trump. And he's always been that way for decades. He hates people dying, even if they're Ukrainians, right? Meanwhile, you got the neocons in the Democratic Party who are totally fine with sending as many Ukrainians to their death as need be. We don't care. And Trump just wants it all over. He wants peace, and he wants peace through strength. But the left's weaknesses and Joe Biden's weakness just begets more death. So Biden's wars. Biden's were totally, like all of them, totally unnecessary. The withdrawal, Ukraine, and Hamas and Israel. None of those needed to happen and wouldn't have happened if Biden weren't the one in charge. The second biggest thing is inflation, right? Now listen, Trump has a little bit of a role in this. There's COVID, the PPP, and all this stuff. But that stuff would not have caused inflation to go out of control like it did. Because then Biden comes back in and spends another, $6 trillion of all this stuff and made our lives way worse. And none of this was necessary. This is a bad decision, bad policy, bad bills. I've asked every single guest today what the worldview is of these presidents that they say are the worst. And Biden is just another example. Someone got in his ear, or he thought he would be the man of legacy if he just continued on with the policies of Woodrow Wilson, FDR, LBJ, Barack Obama. He needed his big, grand public project, right? His big New Deal. And the left loves FDR so much, they love the name New Deal, that every progressive president is coming up with their own new version of the New Deal. We call it the Green New Deal or whatever. And all these bailouts and transportation projects, it was just Biden's version of the New Deal. So inflation is crushing Americans, worse than many of us have ever lived through. Didn't need to be that way. Didn't need to be that way at all. Third reason why Joe Biden should be considered as one of the worst presidents ever, I don't know, maybe letting in tens of millions of illegal aliens? Intentionally? Actively going out of his way to take away border protections on day one of his administration, proudly doing that on day one, proudly stopping the wall, proudly ending Remain in Mexico, going out of his way, and then lying to us. Mayorkas and all of his cronies lying to us saying the border is secure. People murdered, children raped, entire towns taken over, telling us the border's secure. Amazing. Can Trump bail Biden out for the harm that Biden caused the American people these last 4 years just on immigration alone? Didn't need to happen. Fourth reason, but you know what they were trying to do, of course, right? Trying to win every election in the future. That's the goal of that. Mission not accomplished. Fourth reason why Joe Biden is one of the worst presidents ever is embracing the wokeness of the radical left, embracing it and trying to mainstream it. The other day one thing he did was allow boys and girls sports. That was a day one executive order that Joe Biden did, right? There's this survey that was done. This is by a Democratic group, and they did an analysis on swing voters who voted for Trump, right? Swing voters who went for Trump. And they're like, oh, can you believe it? That 83% of these swing voters who voted for Trump think that Biden or Kamala wanted to use taxpayer dollars to pay for the transition transition charges for illegal aliens in prison. Can you believe 83% of people support that? It's like, yeah, I want to talk to the 17 who don't think that that's what happened, because that's exactly what Kamala Harris supported, and she's bragged about it before. They're like, can you believe that 77% of these people believed that Kamala Harris, wanted, and Joe Biden wanted to transition people under 18 without parental consent? It's like, yeah, they did that. Can you believe that Joe Biden and Kamala, 76% of people thought that they want abortion up to birth? Yeah, because they did. All this super crazy, insane woke stuff. All these, Biden wanted to do this stuff and did it. And Kamala wanted to do it and did it. And that's why people voted for Trump, to rebuke against all that. We're not the ones who put drag queens in our kids' elementary school. That was you guys. You're the people who arrested grandmothers who were blocking access to the abortion clinic, even though local police didn't prosecute at all, but the feds did. Biden did that. My last point, Biden will go down as the president who led all this lawfare. And it's by the grace of God that it all failed. No matter how many lawsuits they tried, they couldn't bankrupt him, and they couldn't keep him down. And Biden should be held accountable for that. And of course, never forget how he and his wife and the media lied to us about his health. So I don't know. It's hard to say worst president ever. We'll give a little more time to see how his presidency ages. Will it age like a fine wine, or will it age like that gallon of milk I left in the back of the car the other day? But it's sure hard to think of any reason why he would be ranked in the top half. That's for sure. But the best thing about Biden's failure is that it led to Trump. And for that reason, I'll always be eternally grateful to old Joe. The First TV, Mike Slater. Spread the word.